Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's with a peculiar pleasure that I introduce Mr. Burzine Waghmar. He's a very assiduous student, very hardworking, also happens to be a very good friend. His speciality is Bactrian studies. He will be submitting his thesis shortly, and we shall have to call him Dr. Waghmar. So, in the meantime, I'm taking advantage of using his first name. Welcome, Burzine. Now, briefly, among the Parsis, there are some strange beliefs. Among these beliefs is that in the year 642, the infamous battle when the Arabs first started taking over Iran. From then on, the belief persists that there were these conversions, instant conversions to Islam at the point of a sword. Who's in here will let us know that this is not exactly the case, and he has some very interesting things to say. So without further preamble, I will hand over the mic to Burzine. Burzine, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Vajifdar. Am I audible? Yes. Good. The Muslim Arabs' disastrous defeat of the Sasanid Empire opened a new chapter in the long history of Iran. In distant Hijaz, in the city of Mecca, Muhammad ibn Abdullah had given to an idolatrous and strife-ridden people a new religion, which inculcated monotheism, its message coming later in the Quran to bait the Arabs to submit as people accountable to God and fearful of his wrath. Some of them were so inspired by this new teaching that they undertook the conquest of the world about them, to achieve at the same time in this holy war the reward of a share in the world to come, paradise, in a word. Muhammad's death in 632 was followed in his successor Abu Bakr's time by a crisis of apostasy, the Ridda, which put both the religion and the government of Medina in jeopardy. The faith and the polity which Muhammad had promulgated there were shaken, but nonetheless, the new Islamic vigor was enough to achieve dominion over all the Arabian Peninsula. Once the apostasy had been suppressed, closer unity followed with greater zeal to sacrifice all in a larger struggle. The end of the Ridda wars left the Arabs poised for holy war for the sake of Islam, ready to challenge even Byzantium and Iran. From as early as before the advent of Alexander the Great, Arabs had been known to Iran. In the Sasanid period, from 226 to 651 AD, their jurisdiction reached as far as the western outskirts of Tesfan, Al-Madain. According to Tabari, Shapur I settled some of the tribe of Bakr bin Wa'il in Kirman, and Arab merchants as well as Arab pirates frequented the shores of the Persian Gulf. Arab-occupied areas too in proximity to so imposing a structure as the Sasanid state could not escape being under Iran's influence, if not its full dominion. For example, from ancient times, Bahrain and Qatif had been Iranian protectorates. Shapur II, 309 through 79 AD, had subdued the whole of the western side of the Gulf, and it seems that from the time of Ardisha I, 226 through 41, the Azd tribes had chosen to settle in Oman under Iranian rule. In Bahrain, the Tamim, Abd al-Qais, and a section of the Bakr bin Wa'il tribes were in Hajar, in the center of Bahrain, under direct Iranian influence. From Shapur II's time, the Lakhmi Philologate of Al-Hira appointed their own nominee as Amir. But in later Sasanid times, this Amir was generally under the supervision of a high-ranking Iranian revenue official. Those Arabs under Sasanid jurisdiction acted under that government's protection, especially in the matter of conducting overland trade with Byzantium and Egypt, through Mesopotamia, that is Iraq, and Syria, and with India through the Yemen and Bahrain. The emergence of the Sasanid navy owed a great deal to the cooperation which existed with the Arabs. Khosrow I, 531 through 79, intervened in Yemeni affairs on the pretext of aiding the Arabs against Byzantium, with the result that Iranian forces replaced Ethiopian there. Among the secretaries of the Sasanid court was one for Arab affairs. He also acted as interpreter, and his salary and maintenance was supplied in kind by the Hira Arabs. Thus, from ancient times, Iran had had contacts varying in degree of closeness and amity with the Arabs. Before the Sasanian era, Arab tribes had settled in the Tigris-Euphrates region, the Al-Sawad, and though at the beginning of the era, Arish I had wrested from them the district known as Maisan, that is to say in southern Iraq, on the Persian Gulf, influence continued right to the period of Yazid III. The Muslims' penetration of Iraq began under the first Caliph Abu Bakr, 632 through 634. His intent may have been twofold: raiding the settled communities along the Sasanian Empire's fringes and imposing Muslim authority over those Arabs living in the lower reaches of Asuristan, southern Iraq. The Muslim thrust reached the city of Hira, and although outnumbered, Arab Muslims led by the so-called sword of Islam, Khalid ibn Abd al-Walid, triumphed, drove off the Iranian forces, and imposed terms of capitulation on Hira's residents in the summer of 633. It is likely the Iranian military assumed that this offensive was nothing more than a raid by nomads from the desert. But when Muslim forces plundered other towns, the empire struck back. The Sasanian army commenced an operation to retake Hira, inflicting a major defeat of the Muslim reinforcements sent by the new Caliph, Omar I, at the Battle of the Bridge in October 634. Factional strife in the royal city of Tisfun, distracted the Iranians from taking any further action against the vanquished Muslim forces. Soon therefore, the Muslims returned, this time occupying Hira permanently. Then their troops confronted the Sasanian army's vanguard at Qadisiyah. Islamic accounts suggest that the Arab units commanded by Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and the Sasanian forces led by Rustam Farrokh maintained a standoff for 4 months. Once again, the empire's soldiers outnumbered the invaders. But when battle finally ensued in June 637, the Sasanian forces retreated after their commander was slain. Even though they regrouped at Babel, here too their opponents were victorious. The road to Tesfin now lay open. Realizing their vulnerability, Iranian landlords, Dehagon, Arabic Dekhan, who lived along the Tigris' west bank, sent emissaries to Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas seeking peace. He enjoined them to accept Islam or else pay tribute. The Iranians chose to buy protection, paying both a poll tax, Arabic jizya, from the Pahlavi Ghazidak as we know, and a land tax, Arabic kharaj, Pahlavi baj, to the Arab conquerors. The struggle for control of Tesfin consisted of sundry skirmishes and a siege. According to one Christian source, famine, sickness, and death gripped the city. The city's Bahur-Asir quarter, Way Ardashir, was evacuated in early August 637, and Yazid III, 632 through 51, that is, the last Sasanian king of kings, moved with his entourage eastward to the town of Hulwan, Piero's Cower. The Arabs then forded the Tigris, attacking the eastern Asbanbar, and the Atika quarters, where the royal palace and the audience hall were located. According to one record, when the Muslims reached the White Palace, where some individuals had fortified themselves, an Iranian peeped out and spoke to us. We answered him and made several offers saying, "There are 3 choices available to you." The Iranians asked what these options were. The Muslims are said to have responded, "If you espouse our faith, Islam, you will have the same rights and responsibilities as us. If you spurn Islam, then you will have to pay us tribute. If you reject that option too, and only that option then, meet us in combat, and God will choose between you and us." A spokesperson for the besieged Iranians replied, "We reject the first and the last choices. However, we agreed to the second one." The rest of the Zoroastrian population in the imperial capital chose this option as well. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas then stationed troops and their attendants in the city, basing them apart from the native residents. The Arabs' firm control over the former seat of Sasanian power ensured that the Zoroastrians there would coexist alongside the incoming Muslims without posing any threat. The Muslim armies then advanced northeastward to Galul, located in the Diyala River basin. There, during the final months of 637 or beginning 638, an Iranian contingent led by Khwarazad brother of the late General Rustam I alluded to earlier, who directed the Sasanids at Qadisiyah, was defeated, and the women were taken as concubines to bear children for Muslim masters. When Jalula fell, Yazdegerd III abandoned the site of the Hulwan and fled further eastward on the Iranian plateau. At that point, the Muslim records present Omar instructing Arab generals on how to treat the captured Iranians. An edict supposedly ordered goes as follows, quote, "Preserve their previous status, except for individuals who continue to side with the enemy and are captured. Treat the peasants exactly as you treated others before them. When you enjoin them to adopt Islam, but they opt to pay the poll tax, and you accept it and send them back home, so on and so forth, and then that action constitutes granting them protection." Close quote. It is a story which illustrates an attitude that prevailed in Islamic culture only around the 9th century, but reflects a pragmatic opinion available to the Arabs during the 7th. In Lower and Upper Iraq indeed, treaties involving the taxation of subjects rather than repeated battles and constant repression became the norm, leading to peaceful relations in following years. The 9th century historian Tabari, reflecting the opinions of his sources, wrote that once Arab control over Iraq was secure, Omar permitted Muslim troops to move further into Iranian territory. Arab generals established garrisons from whence they could proceed towards regions assigned to them for conquest. Although Muslim authorities based at Tesfin do seem to have gradually developed plans to raid the whole of Iran, we do not know whether they intended to create an empire or to resettle Arab tribes throughout the new territories. With or without a master plan, Muslims went on the attack, both to head off any counter-thrusts that would have dislodged them, and to extract wealth from the inhabitants of cities on the Iranian plateau. Pragmatism and opportunism thus had important counterbalancing roles. When the Arabs ventured into Khuzestan, that is also known as Arabistan now, at the southwestern corner of the Iranian plateau, they found the site of Shustar difficult to capture. A squad of Muslim soldiers finally managed to enter Shustar via an aqueduct and to open the gates. The people of Ram Hormuz are said to have negotiated an accord involving tribute payment with the advancing Arabs, and an Iranian prince named Hormuz, Arabic Hormuzan, agreed to serve as the Arabs' tax collector. Once the Muslims moved on nonetheless, the residents refused to meet their obligations, and so the Arab units had to return and forcefully reinstate the agreement. Muslim legions from Basra, led by Abu Musa al-Ashari, Abu Sabra ibn Abu Rahim al-Qurayshi and others, reached Susa, Shush, surrounding it. It is unclear whether the Iranian occupants put up a fight or capitulated quickly by agreeing to a treaty. They may have sued for peace when they heard that the Sasanian army was retreating and the king fleeing. The Muslim forces then advanced on the remaining major settlement in this region. In general, rebellions by local Zoroastrians kept the Muslims in Khuzestan on guard for the first few years, so the Arabs established permanent garrisons to enforce their authority. Tribes moved into the area on the heels of the soldiers, entrenching the Muslims' dominance there. Seeing little chance of success, the region's Zoroastrians gradually halted their efforts to win liberation. Subjugation of the people of Azerbaijan or Azerbaijan, Atropatene, to the northwest, as in Iraq and Khuzestan, began with raids. The Muslim general Hudayfa ibn Yamam al-Absi was notified by the Caliph that he would be placed in charge of any parts of Azerbaijan that he won for the Arabs. In 641 or 43, Hudayfa attacked the province with soldiers from Kufa, much in the news as you would know today. The Sasanian troops stationed in Azerbaijan held off the advancing Arab forces for several days, but soon realized that their struggle was hopeless, since the neighboring province of Iraq was already in Muslim hands. Consequently, the residents, upon urging by their border governor, or Margrave Pahlavi Mazdeans, and the administrative city of Ardabil, agreed to pay annual taxes to the Muslims. In return, they received personal liberty, retention of their customs, and protection of their fire temples, especially the one at Takht Suleiman or Shiz, that is near Ganja Janza, where a sacred fire called Al-Gushnas burned. Because an accord had been reached, the Arabs did not maintain a substantial presence in Azerbaijan. Free from Muslim military oversight, the people of Azerbaijan stopped paying tribute, as had the people of Ram Hormuz, and when Omar I died. Al-Walid ibn Uqba Abi Mu'ayyid, another Muslim commander, then was dispatched to re-establish the original treaty's terms. The Arabs' troops' presence notwithstanding, rebellions broke out again at Ardabil, Ganjak, and other cities in Azerbaijan during a change in command when Shayd ibn Qais al-Kindi succeeded Walid ibn Uqba as governor. According to the Futu al-Buldan, conquest countries, important Arab treaties, an early victory narrative written in Arabic by Baladhuri, its author, during the 9th century goes as follows. Quote, Ashak had to travel from place to place, overpowering the inhabitants. Then he colonized these sites with Arabs, close quote. Once Muslim men had established long-term lodgings in and around the metropolitan areas, their families in Kufa, Basra, and Syria were anxious to join them. So each man appropriated whatever he could, although some did purchase land from the Iranians. The Muslim settlements and the constant influx of new troops dampened the Zoroastrians' acrimony, for that made future intercommunal violence infrequent. Because of its location, Azerbaijan then became a staging ground for the Muslims' attacks against the Byzantines and Khazars during the Umayyad era. Heartland. Details of Muslim military advances onto the plateau, especially into the province of Maha or the Jebel, often vary, with conflicting information preserved in the chronicles. The conflicts undoubtedly produced social upheaval when towns were destroyed and urban populations were displaced. As one Zoroastrian document claims, the Arabs burn and loot the dwellings of householders and the estates of landlords. Yet, most sources do not indicate that the destruction was rampant. Perhaps it was limited, if at all, by the relatively small Sasanian urban sites. Most locations denoted as cities actually then again consisted of a central fortified area that housed soldiers and administrators, while families who did not belong to the civil service lived in suburbs located around the administrative center. Muslim troops usually targeted fortresses for assault, keeping the residential neighborhoods for plunder and settlement only. A major battle took place at Nihavand, southwest of present-day Hamadan, in the spring or summer of 642. A large Iranian force from across the empire had gathered here to repel the Arabs. Omar I decided to avert this by dispatching Muslim legions from Kufa. Before the battle, the Arab general Nu'man ibn Muqarrin al-Muzani sent an emissary to the Iranian commander, whose name may have been Wahman or Mardan Shah, one is unclear from the sources, to suggest that the Iranians surrender and thereby avoid bloodshed. The Zoroastrian general is said to have dismissed this proposal with the words, "Distaste for your corpses polluting the air is the only thing preventing me from commanding my marksmen to shoot all of you with a salvo of arrows, for you are foul." Close quote. When the Arabs then attacked, the two armies fought a mighty battle with their weapons, raising a great clamor such as never been heard before. Despite heavy losses, including that of their leader, the Muslims were eventually victorious, a victory that proved decisive, since the Iranians never again amassed an army of that size. Afterwards, the Muslims established a base at Nihavand, from which the Arab conscripts headed for the northern, southern, and eastern provinces of Iran Shah. The terms of tribute agreed on by the Arabs and their Nor, the Sasanian Marzban of this area, are said to have become standard for the whole region. It is likely, however, that this claim arose from later attempts by Muslim historians to schematize the literature pertaining to individual pacts. In part, the Covenant of Nihavand stipulated that if the land and poll taxes were paid, the safety of the residents' possessions and homes would be assured, and nor would the Arabs kill or enslave anyone. Close quote. Qum, or Iran Dinat Kawad, Qum, known to the Arabs as Qumdan, was taken by Muslim forces from Basra after a few days of battle in 644. Landlords sent the tribute that was imposed to Muslim leaders in Iraq, thus retaining their own authority over their fellow natives. Some Arab soldiers and their families obtained residences in Qom, and others were provided with tracts of land confiscated from Sasanian crown holdings. Over the years, more Muslims moved into nearby towns like Jamkharan, and at the end of the 7th century, followers of the Muslim rebel governor Abdul Rahman ibn Muhammad ibn Ashnad al-Kindi came to Qom seeking safe haven among the Zoroastrians there. Two of these refugees were the brothers Abdullah al-Ashari and Ahwas al-Ashari, who had previously aided the district's residents in a struggle to resist Daylamite overlordship. If an account in the Tariq Qom, history of Qom, is accurate, parochial Zoroastrians, guided by Magnatian Yazdan Piroz, welcomed these Muslims, giving them land west of the main town to live on and cultivate. Arabs also reached the plain of Isfahan, Aspadana or Spahan, and the Iranians there inhabited several interconnected towns with Ajay, Gabe, the Sasanid administrative center, and Yahudiya, the largest residential settlement. As the name suggests of the latter, this was predominantly a Jewish locality, where Zoroastrians and Christians lived in clusters throughout the other towns. Baladuri tells us a tale about an Iranian princely client, a Mawla Arab client, named Hormuz, who advised Omar I, Isfahan is the head, and Azerbaijan is the flank. Lop off the head, and that flank will fall with the head along with it. According to Omar, dispatched units from Basra to secure control of Isfahan. There were accounts of battles which are full of contradictions, however, which appear to be modeled on events at Nehawan, to which they bear prosopographic similarities. The Muslims in general, led by Abdullah ibn Budayl ibn Waghmar, advanced across outlying areas until they reached and assailed Jay for several days. The Margrave Marfan of Isfahan fled with a troop of archers, but was outpaced by the Arabs, who compelled him to accede to terms of coexistence. The surviving records claim that the Iranian residents violated this treaty within 24 hours and had to be resubjugated. Abdullah ibn Budayl stayed on at the city with his troops, serving as tax collector, Amil, until the third Orthodox Caliph Othman replaced him. When an Arab expedition from Kufa arrived at Ray, just outside modern Iran, Rages, it encountered an Iranian force composed of soldiers from both the Jebel and the Dailan. Once again there was a battle, which concluded with the city's denizens petitioning the Arabs for terms of submission. The Arabs consented, and the Iranians began to pay taxes on condition that, quote, Muslims would not slay or take captive anyone, nor destroy fire temples, and would regard them on par with the people of Nehawan for tax purposes, is to be noted. But it was, as a common feature of many surrenders, local Zoroastrians rebelled after the main contingent of Muslim forces had departed. The Arabs then in turn had to turn back and reimpose the terms of submission. A later Shi'i source mentions that Ali bin Abi Talib, Imam Ali to the Shias, wisely steered Omar into sending Muslim soldiers to prevent the inhabitants of Isfahan, Nehawan and Ray from uniting to expel the Arabs. The uprisings at Ray continued until around 655, at which time all resistance was decisively crushed, and an Arab administrator took up residence in the fortress, formerly used by the Sasanid Mazdeans. Individual Muslim soldiers later seized plots of land to settle on. As a token of their total capitulation, the Iranians in this province were required to guide travelers, maintain the roads, and extend hospitality for one day and night to passing Muslim troops who seek shelter with them. The Arabs' first incursion into Fars, ancient Pars, or the plain of Pars that is, a traditional bastion of Zoroastrianism, was a foray across the Persian Gulf in 635. Al-Ala ibn al-Hadrami, the Muslim military governor of Bahrain, launched an unauthorized raiding expedition. Tabari, misled by an account from Saif ibn Umar, dates this to about 638. According to his probably exaggerated version, Muslim warriors landed on the coast of Fars and then advanced across the region towards the provincial capital at Istakh, but were routed. On returning to the seashore, they found that their ships had been scuttled. For these Muslims, fortunately, or so Saif states, reinforcements arrived from Iraq and Khuzestan in the nick of time, permitting their safe evacuation. Aside from this raid, the Muslim conquest of Fars began in earnest a few years later, and only a few years later, mind you. These later attacks were launched from Bahrain and directed by Uthman ibn al-Thaqafi. Thereafter, command of the Muslim troops and settlers passed to Abdullah bin Amir ibn Qurayz, the chief administrator of Basra. Resistance was stiff, however, so it took a decade to capture the whole province. The small town of Tawaj fell in 640 and was colonized by the Arab tribes such as the Abd al-Qais. The people in and around Kazron, paid taxes on condition that they not be killed or enslaved, and they reluctantly assented to Muslim settlement there. The important religious center of Darab-Gird, Arabic Darab-Jird, also became an Arab possession. A Zoroastrian theologian or teacher priest, Pahlavi Herbert, Arabic Harbid, or some sources also call him a mutakallimin, a scholast, etc., who served as the area's Sasanian administrator, negotiated an accord placing the Zoroastrians at Darabgir on par with individuals elsewhere in terms of taxation and personal liberty. The authority of the indigenous clerics in this respect is not surprising, as they were the official Sasanian administrators at the district level. Treaties notwithstanding, and following a pattern recurring across Iran Shahar, insurrections took place at these sites whenever Abdullah ibn Amir's units left. And then the Muslim forces had to return, retake the towns, and re-establish the treaties of capitulation. Mutinies, nonetheless, by Zoroastrians persisted for several years, and then the Muslims' responses grew harsher. And eventually, the native inhabitants had to resign themselves to the new elite's presence. An area now known as Qasr Abu Nasr used to be the Sasanian citadel of Shiraz, according to clay ceilings bearing this place name found in the ruins there. The site was captured by Arab forces around 644, but continued to flourish as a Zoroastrian center for many years thereafter. The absence of Umayyad reform coins among the archaeological remains suggests that the Muslims did not base their administrators here. The limited quantity of other Islamic currency found at Qasr Abu Nasr, Arabo-Sasanian silver coins, copper and bronze coins, together with specimens issued by Abbasids, indicates that it arrived via trade or other means such as hoarding, rather than because Muslims settled here. Then in the early 8th century, an Arab administrator named Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi established a garrison roughly 6 miles to the northwest of the citadel. People slowly relocated there, and the new site grew into the present city of Shiraz. This sequence of events conforms to one of two major patterns of early Arab Muslim settlements in Iran: the founding of a new base where the followers of Muhammad, the Prophet, could live safely but separately from the native Zoroastrians. Events at Istakra are known to have been far more violent. The city was briefly captured in 644 by the commanders Abu Musa al-Ashari and Uthman ibn Abi al-Ais, but shortly thereafter, an Arab governor stationed there was slain by the natives. The inhabitants of Istakra succumbed to Arab forces a second time only after a bitter conflict, during which much of the city was demolished by assaults from mangonels in 650. In that year, Abdullah ibn Amir massacred most of the noble families and destroyed the city. Still, the Zoroastrians who had fled Istakra to survive the Muslim onslaught are said to have returned to stage yet another uprising during the caliphate of Ali ibn Abi Talib. There are numerous reports of Muslims taking Zoroastrian women as concubines and children as slaves during the persistent conflict for political dominance here. Men captured in battle at Istakra had to serve the Arabs in various capacities for many years. As a major document lamented, during the time, quote, the Zoroastrians received little for their toil, close quote. Over the course of these turbulent events, various Muslim commanders struck coins bearing the city's mint name to pay their troops. Istakra, the Sasanian royal family's birthplace, was an extreme example of opposition to Muslim hegemony. But the events here were by no means unique, as evidenced by accounts from Darabgir and elsewhere in Fars. Farmers in the heavily populated valleys and nomads in the hills repeatedly resisted Muslim incursions onto their lands. Not surprisingly, the passion of cross-communal contact among the Zoroastrians and Muslims on the Central Plateau was greatly influenced by this persistent hostility. Arabs invaded the province of Kerman, located on the southern littoral, around the middle of the 7th century. The Zoroastrian Margrave of Kerman was slain early on in battle, and his soldiers were routed. The province was sparsely inhabited, with the city spread far apart, so at many spots, the Muslim armies may have encountered only token resistance. The provincial capital of Xinjiang, Shiragan, or Kerman city, had to be besieged for a few days, as this city's inhabitants had fortified themselves inside before it surrendered. The people of Jiruft, Archaeology, and Baradasir, Arabic Baradasir, Pahlavi Weh or Dashir, also put up short-lived and unsuccessful defenses. The occupants of Bam made a pact with the Arabs, then violated it, and had to force it to be yielded again. Muslim soldiers were stationed at all four sides in cantonments that facilitated Arab expansion further east. As the strategic needs of each city, of the Muslim occupiers, changed, so did the relative importance of each city, and during the 10th century, Bahr al-Sir eventually replaced Xinjiang as the province's administrative center. The north. When the Arabs first entered Daylam, later Gilan, Tabaristan, Mazandaran, and Gurgan, Hirkani or Jurjan, these regions were strongholds of Zoroastrianism. But the Zoroastrians in these Caspian districts, a region known as a whole by the name Padish Khwargar, did not always follow orthodox praxis as delineated by the Sasanian priests. Early in the 3rd century, the chief magus Tosar or Tonsar had attempted, without much success, to root out the heterodox practices. And these Zoroastrians' successive disputes with the Sasanian clergy and administrators had strengthened their resistance to outsiders. They would agree to decrees from the central government and then ignore them, a practice that came in handy against the Arabs, obviously. Around 643, the Muslim commander Suwaid ibn Muqayrin al-Muzani led an army to Tabaristan to lay out terms of peace. A Zoroastrian prince from the town of Amul, who served as that province's leader, or as a Ispahabad, made peace by paying a certain tribute on condition the Muslims would not attack. Another Arab force, led by Sa'id ibn al-As, had moved eastward, raiding hamlets along the fertile lowlands of Gurgan, until a Sasanian governor named Rozban offered tribute in exchange for personal and religious freedom. Meanwhile, the people of Tabaristan disregarded their agreement with the Muslims, just as they had done for decades under the Sasanians. Sa'id ibn al-As thus felt he had little choice but to redirect his troops into Tabaristan and once more pressure its inhabitants to pay their dues. A consequence, therefore, was that widespread rebellion against Muslim overlordship broke out, with the Iranians rejecting talk of peace and fighting the Arabs with considerable success. This resistance infuriated the Muslim general, who, according to one overstatement, put them all to death, one to a man, when he finally subdued the rebel camps. Such victories netted the Arabs considerable booty. But success in battle did not result in Muslim control over the hilly littoral. Whenever the Muslim forces left Tabaristan, its inhabitants rebelled. Nobody could travel through that area along the road to Khorasan for dread of the local people, it was reported. Sometimes they paid tithe, and on other occasions they refused to do so. Gurgan too was not always a peaceful place, and so around the year 716, another Arab general, Yazid ibn al-Muhallab, besieged that province's main city, also named Gurgan, that is near modern Gonbad-e-Qaboos, and divided by a river into the neighborhoods known as Dehistan and Bakrabad. After 6 months, Yazid's soldiers from Kufa and Basra succeeded in reimposing a peace treaty with the people on the same terms as they had received previously. They also subjugated Astarabad city, Katipa, located 15 miles to the southwest near the provincial boundary. Yazid appointed a Muslim governor for Gurgan from the Arab tribe of Azd and moved on to subdue Tabaristan again. When Yazid attacked Amul and Sarin, a Zoroastrian Ispahabad named Farrokh Khan sued for peace. But Yazid, hoping to annex the entire province of Tabaristan, rejected Farrokh Khan's offer. Faced with a Muslim onslaught, Farrokh Khan requested assistance from the Margrave of Dailam, residing at the city of Rasht. The Ispahabad also incited the Zoroastrians in Gurgan to rebel, resulting in those peoples breaking ranks with the Arab overlords once more. Quote, from a report, they pounced upon the Muslims whom Yazid had stationed there and slew as many of them as possible, close quote. One description of this uprising in Gurgan observed that some Arab soldiers were able to hide in a mountain fortress until Yazid ibn al-Muhallab rescued them. Another, more polemical version states that every Muslim was killed during a single night. Such events in Gurgan compelled Yazid to reconsider the offer of peace from Farrokh Khan on behalf of the people of Tabaristan. The Muslim forces then had to journey back to Gurgan, fight the metropolitan residents, and storm remote strongholds before they could capture the province's Iranian magnate and his followers. Enmity between Zoroastrians and Muslims culminated with Arab soldiers hanging Iranian warriors and taking, as usual, captured their women and children, if the details provided by the Tariq-e-Tabaristan are accurate. Up to the 9th century then, along the western shore, the Daylamites were able to ward off the repeated Muslim attempts at entrenchment. Zoroastrian aristocrats paid taxes to the Abbasid caliphs at Baghdad only sporadically, while continuing to assist island renegades against Sunni rulers. That is, schismatists, Shia schismatists against the mainstream Sunni elites and rulers. Reconciliation between the Arab conquerors and their Iranian subjects here did not take place for many decades, and Islam did have difficulty taking a hold in any of these three provinces. Whereas the Persian elements can be more clearly distinguished in the Islamic tradition, the hadith, which often reflect or confirm local customs, practices, and ideas, such elements cannot always be established with precision in the Quran. The uncompromising and austere monotheism of Muhammad has molded and even adaptations of Judeo-Christian concepts and terms in such a fashion that they lose their original coloring and strike one as freshly conceived. The pervasive force of his belief in the unity of God makes, in the words of the late Alessandro Bausani, the Old Testament itself almost polytheistic in comparison. Furthermore, it does not appear that Muhammad had direct contact with a living community practicing an Iranian religion, but it is clear that Zoroastrianism belonged to Muhammad's religious horizon. In fact, he mentions the Majus, along with Jews, Sabians, and Christians, in contrast to idolaters in the Quran, Surah 22, Ayat 17, Surah Al-Hajj, chapter 22, verse 17, the only time the word for Zoroastrians is used and the only time they are ever mentioned, and that too in just passing. We must also allow that some of the coincidences between the Quran and Iranian religious texts or ideas may have resulted from the reverse process of the effect of Islam on Zoroastrian 9th century books, which after all are our only teaching source for sustaining Zoroastrianism, even though their contents generally go back to pre-Islamic times. The first serious attempt to address the question of Iranian influence on Islam was by the noted French Orientalist Edgar Blanchet, who in his article, Études sur l'histoire religieuse de l'Iran, concluded after examining all relevant sources that the source of the legend as developed by traditionalists, Akhbaris, and exegetes, tafsir writers, with regard to Muhammad's ascent into heaven on the basis of the laconic and ambiguous Quranic verse, Surah 17, Ayat 1 of the Miraj, could not be other than the heavenly journeys in Iranian tradition, of which, of course, the best known example is that of Arda-Viraz and his visit to heaven and hell, a legend which served also as the ultimate prototype for Dante's Divina Commedia. He strengthened his thesis by arguing that Buraq, the mount with the body of a donkey and a human face on which the prophet is said to have made his ascent, is a foreign term derived from Middle Persian Barak, Persian Bara, mount, used in somewhat similar contexts. Blanchet's article was followed by that brilliant Hungarian scholar Ignaz Goldziher, whose earnest and more comprehensive article, Islamisme et Persisme, translated also into English in 1911, Islamism and Parsism, is a seminal landmark article which actually for the first time examines Parsi correspondences in early Islam. Quote from Ignaz Goldziher, "Until now, less attention has been paid to one of the most important elements of the religious development of Islam, that is the Persian element." Close quote. Exercised under these two forms of borrowing and reaction, it has been a decisive influence on the formation of the character of Islam. Among the influences that Goldziher attributes to the time of the emergence of Islam, he includes the prescription of 5 diurnal canonical prayers, modeled on the Zoroastrian practice after it had been fixed at 3 times a day as mentioned in the Quran, eschatological elements transmitted partly through the mediation of Judaism and Christianity, especially the Book of Enoch, and only partly directly from Zoroastrianism into Islam, but through the Judeo-Christian filters. The harsh view of the kafirs or unbelievers and counting them as ritually unclean, which of course is less compatible, he remarks, with the Judeo-Christian notion of polytheism and unbelief than with the Zoroastrian attitude actually towards unbelievers and heretics. Vajifdar 537, for example, designating Friday as a counterpart of the Jewish Sabbath and yet not as a day of rest, which conforms better to the Zoroastrian belief that creation was realized in 6 stages, but was not followed by a period of inactivity for Aura Mazda. Goldziher draws attention also to a number of developments and practices that show Persian influence and are reflected in traditions and legal texts. For instance, religious prescriptions concerning ritual purity, particularly with respect to the uncleanliness of the human corpse, treated so prominently in the Vajifdar and its commentaries, meritorious recitation or chanting of holy texts, especially the Quran, and the Shiite practice of having the Quran chanted during the mourning periods for the happiness of the soul of the departed, contribute to the same practice among the Zoroastrians for the remission of the sins of the deceased or the living. The weighing of the good and evil deeds in scales mizan at the day of judgment, and the use of quantitative numerical yardsticks to measure them, as well as recourse to certain formulaic numbers in both religions. The inordinate number of traditions on the merits of the use of the miswak, toothbrush, considered a virtuous act also among the Zoroastrians, Shahs Nishais 1020, 1213, and Dadistan Dinik 14:8, a revealing detail in itself. Among the influences through opposition and negative reaction, he also cites the attitude towards the dog, a sacred animal in Mazdeism, but ending up eventually as ritually unclean in Islam. Goldziar's furnishes references to both Islamic and Iranian sources to prove his remarks, but in spite of the almost passionate tone of his article, he does remind the reader, cautious and prudent scholar that he was, that his thesis is only a hypothesis and not the last word on the issues raised. A year later, in 1902, Louis Gray's Zoroastrian Elements in Muhammadan Eschatology appeared. Basing himself as far as Islam was concerned on the works of Wolff and Whittling, Gray drew a detailed list of parallels between Zoroastrian eschatological beliefs and Islamic ones as they're expressed in the Quran or in popular folk Islam, including bodily resurrection, personification of one's deeds in the form of a beautiful or abominable figure, the angels who record men's deeds or question the souls of the deceased, judgment of the soul by weighing its actions in a balance, the bridge to the cross, which is as thin as a hair or sharp as a razor's edge for sinners, but wide for the virtuous, punishment in hell or reward in paradise, and an intermediate station between the two, Hamis the Gone for the Zoroastrians and Araf in Islam. He drew particularly on Ghazali's Al-Dura al-Faqira, which bears striking resemblance to Zoroastrian writing on the fate of departing souls and the final judgment. In some respects, however, the two traditions are divergent. One major difference being that in Islam, reward and punishment are eternal, though in the Zoroastrian faith, all souls are eventually purified and admitted to the blissful, renovated world. Gray also briefly compares the notion of a savior in both faiths, Sochiath in Zoroastrianism, the Mahdi in Islam, a topic that James Darmstetter had also treated earlier in detail. Actually in his work, The Mahdi Past and Present, New York, 1885. Gray shows awareness also of the existence of some of the ideas also in Christianity, but does not concern himself with channels of transmission. K. Inestrancev in his Sasanid Etude, published in 1909, stressed the importance of studying Sasanian civilization in order to better understand the Sasanians' effect on Islamic culture, devoting a chapter each to Sasanian literature, war techniques and weapons, and Nowruz and Mehergan festivals, among other respective ceremonies. He stressed their effect on the Islamic society of early centuries with liberal quotations from Arabic sources, without, however, specifying any additional cases of borrowing related to pre-Islamic Arabia. He does draw attention, however, to pre-Islamic monuments, palaces, fire temples, etc., that continue to exist for several centuries after Islam and have been described by Muslim geographers and travelers. He also stresses the continued existence of large Zoroastrian communities in Persian provinces, Fars in particular, during the first centuries of Islam. In his Debates on Muhammad, the Swedish Islamist scholar Tor Andrade drew attention to the similarity of the events which occurred in conjunction with the birth of the Prophet of Islam and those recounted in the Dinkat about the birth of Zoroaster, Dinkat 7. In his later work on Muhammad, he saw definite traces of Manichaean teaching in the Quranic notion that the Jews neither killed nor crucified Jesus, who merely appeared so to them, but God took him up to himself, a doctrine as espoused by Manichaeans. Among the scholars who have devoted much research to interaction between the peoples of the Middle East and the cultural exchange between them was, of course, also the late Georg Edengren of Uppsala. In his monograph, The Great Waghmar and the Apostle of God, he explored the conception of a cosmic soul or divine principle in the traditions of the Middle East and its manifestation in an apostle or human revealer, the Gnostic orientation of the concept, and the possibility that the Manichaean and Gnostic notion of the cosmic divine principle developed out of an ancient Iranian doctrine, namely the encounter of Zoroaster with Waghmar. Wiedengrain understands Waghmar to be the universal mind or soul, which works along inside individuals, uniting them to their spiritual source, comparable to the unity of Atma and Brahman in the Upanishads. The old concept of an apostle or messenger, the Quranic description of Muhammad as Rasulullah, as well as the claims of several Persian heresiarchs of the 8th century to be messengers, was further elaborated by Wiedengrain in a subsequent monograph, Muhammad the Apostle of God and His Ascension, 1955. He distinguished two kinds of diverging divine secrets to a prophet or apostle. Either the celestial ego descends in some way to the apostle, revealing God's message and investing him with his mission, as seen in Mani's meeting with the twin, and Zoroaster's meeting with Bactrian, or the apostle ascends to heaven to meet his God and to be initiated in divine secrets, as found in Judeo-Christian writings, especially apocalyptic literature, and as Zoroaster was taken by Waghmar to the presence of Ahura Mazda. The ascent is exemplified in Islam by the Prophet's journey to the presence of his Lord, led by the Archangel Gabriel, and is being entrusted with revelations from the Lawh al-Mahfuz, or the so-called guarded tablet of the Quran. Wiedengrain sweepingly in fact states, it is from Iran that proceed all eschatology and all apocalypse. The doctrine of the periods and of resurrection of bodies are specifically Iranian dogmas, and they have attained great signification later. Alessandro Bausani took a fresh look at the question of Iranian impact on Islam and its development in his Persa Religiosa, 1959. He lists a number of cases where he has detected Iranian influence. Quran, Surah 7, Ayat 172, where the Lord asks the children of Adam, "Am I not your Lord? Alastu ana rabbikum?" They say, "Yes, we testify." He quotes two passages from the Bundahishn, 3:21 through 22, on the choice made by man's fravashi, or pre-existing spirit, to go to the corporeal world when asked by Ahura Mazda to choose between either remaining free from aggression and facing Ahriman, or securing immortal bliss at the end. And a passage from the Ayat Kar-e-Jama speak of the text on the choice made by the Amisha Spenters, or holy immortals, when asked by Ahura Mazda who was their Lord and Master. Bausani believes that the essence of the Quranic passage lies precisely in the concept of primordial choice, which is so typically Iranian, but that it must have been taken from a Jewish filter familiar with Iranian ideas. I need 30 minutes more. Quran 2, Surah 2, Ayat 96, Harut and Marut are in some distant echoes filtered through complex sources of the two Zoroastrian Amish Spenters, Horvakat and Amiratat. Quranic allusions to shooting stars hurled at the demons, which has a counterpart in the Mazdean concepts evinced in the Menoge Kharad and the Ayat Kar-e-Jama speak. Other Quranic concepts associated by Bausani with an Iranian background of origin include the number of daily prayers, eschatological description and details such as the scales in which people's deeds are weighed, Huris or heavenly maidens who keep company with the righteous, also the Zarathustra Norma, and the 80 maiden angels who, according to a Saudi Manichaean text, come to meet deceased pious persons and comfort them, an amplification of the Mazdean dialogue. I must contend that the eventual incorporation of Zoroastrians in the category of dhimmis, or people of the covenant, was never unanimously agreed upon among Muslim jurists. Due to a lack of a Quranic precedent for treating them as one of the scriptures, as in Ahlul Kitab stricto sensu, like Jews and Christians, the Caliph Omar was in a fix as to, quote, how to treat these people who are neither Arabs nor people of the book, close quote. However, they were grudgingly accepted based on a tradition preserved by Abd al-Rahman ibn Auf that the Prophet had stated after accepting tribute from the Mazdeans of Hajar, Sunnu bihim sunnata ahl al-kitab, treat them as you would treat the people of the book. Analogously, that is to treat them by extenso as people of the book. Also, in a missive to Mundir ibn Sawad, the ruler of Bahrain, he had permitted them to practice their religion upon these two caveats. Payment of the jizya, but with the caveat, that meat slaughtered by them or marriage to their women was forbidden for Muslims. Which is, of course, in contrast to the other Ahl al-Kitab, Jews and Christians, where, at least in the case of Jews, Muslims are permitted to have kosher meat, and they may marry Jewish or Christian women, who, of course, eventually convert to Islam. But the Zoroastrians, according to Al-Razi, a lady jurist, were placed between the Ahl al-Kitab and the Mushrikun, polytheists, a category unto itself, since it was not deemed to be a religio licita. Al-Shafi declared that while Jews and Christians may receive half the price for blood wheat, the diyar, the next talionist that is, Zoroastrians were to receive only 1/5 of the award. And ill-considered Ahl al-Kitab, the Zoroastrians whittled to a wretched remnant in the rural fastnesses of Iran. The grimmest commentary on their irrelevance is evident in the observations of European researchers and travelers. But their sheer survival, unlike Jews and Christians, who enriched and even briefly flourished in Muslims' Moorish Spain in the Sublime Porte, is a somber testimony of their fidelity. Thank you.